Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we get into the offseason with Frank Madden. We've put together a list of potential targets, what to expect in the offseason for the Bucks, what the second apron means. We get into all of it coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. It is the free agency primer edition. That's Camille Davis and Frank Madden joining us all today. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find it on YouTube as well. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. They help you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That is linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Probably the most highly anticipated episode that we have, maybe every year, but certainly every offseason, and that is when Frank pours over the numbers. And as I mentioned, we had a list of potential targets, what to expect for the Bucks, what are the areas of need. So before we get to any of the players, as I think we've all kind of picked out a few that we've eyed ourselves, I suppose, Frank, the best place to start with is the Bucks need to do what this offseason?
Well, I think we've probably been thinking of this in terms of what the roster needs, right? And I think in kind of simplest terms, I think we've obviously probably all been thinking about how do you make the roster more athletic. And again, I think the three of us have probably all come to a similar conclusion, right? Like, yes, ideally you would get younger and more athletic, but ultimately you need to still be competitive and put yourself in the best position possible to maximize the window that you have with Giannis and perhaps more importantly, Dame and Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez, assuming all those guys are around, just because they're obviously a few years older than Giannis. So I think that there's certainly some, I'd say, roster needs, which obviously we could probably spend, a couple hours on, right? Dissecting exactly what kind of fifth starter you would need, what kind of bench contributors you might want to add. Is there a different flavor that you'd want in the front court aside from Brook Lopez and Bobby Portis? I think there's probably obviously, some debates we could have there, but I would say generally, more athleticism that could go on the wing, that could be also in the front court potentially. Certainly a fifth starter to replace Malik Beasley. As much as I love AJ Green, obviously you want to have more depth, more talent on the wing and in the backcourt than, just assuming that AJ magically becomes that guy himself, or that Andre Jackson Jr., as you guys have been talking about here with the kind of player reviews, that those guys just, take some huge leap. So I'd say that we'll get into kind of some of those, needs and who some of those guys might be. But clearly there's at least, at the very least, even the most optimistic Bucks fan looking at the current roster would say, there's things that you need to do to round out this roster to complement who you have. In particular, I think Dame in the backcourt. But I think the other piece too is, aside from wanting to get better, I think there are kind of like two then related questions. Like, one, how much do you want to actually change up this roster? And, I think Justin, you hinted at it in the Brook Lopez discussion. Like, I don't think they're going to try to trade Brook Lopez, but if you really wanted to do something to shake up this roster, that would be the big move that you could potentially make, assuming that he has trade value. And again, I would assume probably Bobby Portis and Pat Connaughton. The fact that there weren't any trades made around those guys at the deadline probably hints that those guys don't have a ton of value, especially Pat. So maybe Brook does, but and I'm not basing this purely on shots of Giannis and Brook at Disney World, but I would assume Brook is probably around. But again, is there, if not Brook, do you really want to try to trade Pat Connaughton, Bobby Portis? Those are kind of obviously kind of big questions, given that you don't have a lot of other contracts to move. And then I think the third question is financially, do you prioritize when you are potentially making moves with those guys? Are you trying to reduce salary to try to get under the second apron and get some more flexibility, be able to aggregate salaries and trades, be able to trade, have a little bit more ability to make moves on the margins? Because right now, high level, won't go super deep into it, but Bucks are uh, effectively over the second apron for the rest of this cap year. They will be over the second apron, barring, again, a major trade. Even if they kind of just fill out the roster with the picks that they have and minimum contracts, they'd probably be about, I'd say, like 6 million over the second apron. So they'd have to really kind of, deliberately try to get under the second apron with trades, presumably involving Bobby and or Pat, in order to get that flexibility back. So a number of kind of, I think, interconnected discussions there. What kind of players do you want to target? Do you want to potentially make big moves involving some of those bigger, or let's call it medium salaries that are actually on the roster? And when you do that, are you trying to shed salary in a meaningful way to try to get under the second apron and get a little more flexibility? The good news is, past this coming year, you're probably going to see the cap go up by the max of 10% every year for the foreseeable future, because that new TV deal is going to kick in. But right now, this coming season, again, most people are, based on the league estimates, are only projecting about a 5% increase, which again makes the second apron a much tighter squeeze for the Milwaukee Bucks and a number of other top teams. So again, number of questions that kind of set up all of these discussions about what you do in the off season. But I don't know about you guys. I know we were just talking offline before we started about the second apron. Are they going to prioritize saving money? Are they going to prioritize maybe moving any of those big guys? Maybe we start with that. I mean, do you guys actually see this team trying to get under the second apron and get some of that flexibility back? Or given the sacrifices that may be involved, do you think they're just going to say, screw it, we're just going to bite the bullet for another year?
It's tough, right? Because this is going to be the first time that we are seeing these handcuffs put on teams that are over these aprons. And how does that really handicap your ability to put together a championship contending team? Like, my first instinct is just thinking of the ownership group that we have now. And generally, you would think that they're fine with spending money, especially bringing in Mr. Haslam into the ownership group as well. So you would think that spending money is something that they would be okay with if the result is going to be a team that's going to really be contending for a championship. So that's how I'm thinking of it. Now, if the Bucks pivoted and they were like, we're trying to get under the second apron, I think I would be a little shocked about that, to be honest with you, just given the fact of the level of urgency we've seen with the Bucks about trying to get back to the championship, just trying to do roster moves to push them closer to that. And thinking about what that means for the Bucks, if that is the case, where you're trying to just build the best roster that you possibly can. You mentioned the names that you're going to be hearing in trade rumors, if that does come up, with Brook Lopez, Pat Connaughton, Bobby Portis. Even with Bobby Portis, like, reports that have come out later about some of the conversations around him in the trade deadline with that Grant Williams possible trade, is that, that fell apart because the Bucks were looking for additional draft compensation because they felt like they had the better asset in that particular trade with Grant Williams at that time, with a depressed value, who might be somebody who's a trade target for the Bucks at some point. But outside of that, like second apron, I think the three names that you mentioned are the ones to keep in mind. Like, if we are making a trade, these are going to have to be the guys that do it. And then the question is, if you do trade them, is what you're bringing back in going to, like, for example, if you trade Brook Lopez, is whatever you're bringing back in going to give you rim protection? How are you now going to pivot around that? If you're trading out Pat Connaughton, like, do you trust one of these young Bucks on the roster to step up into that role, or can you bring back somebody in that's going to be able to contribute? So it's a lot of different moving pieces to answer, and we can guess how the Bucks might approach it. But to your point, Frank, the answers to those questions will really dictate how it shakes out this offseason.
So in terms of what we would expect them to do, so as you mentioned, they're in the second apron until the end of the league year, so until July 1st. But then, I mean, you're essentially going to be in it for the second year then, or for this next year, unless you do one of those moves, which would basically be, I mean, I know people have talked about it, the names we've mentioned, Bobby Portis and Pat Connaughton. If you just traded one of those and maybe you threw in your first round pick as well for a future first rounder or for a second rounder or something to free up that.
Or a guy making less money, right? Like if you trade
Right.
Bobby Portis for a guy making $7 or $8 million and some
Right.
picks, right? Like then you could,
Yeah.
Along with some other things you could do, you could probably get under the second apron, but it's not easy.
Yeah. And you're going to be flirting with it throughout the year, basically. I think really the only way to get there is if either you trade Bobby Portis or Pat Connaughton for essentially nothing, or you trade Brook Lopez and you bring back a lesser priced player. But it's not even the Giannis thing that we kind of joked about. I still think he's very valuable to this team, and that, I mean, I know you're running out of time, so it's easy to say it's an excuse, but in many ways last year was kind of the year from hell for the Bucks. And I think in some ways you have to chalk it up to, all right, we know this might be the last bullet we have in the chamber, but we think if we get this group together and stay healthy and have the full year of Doc Rivers, and maybe we re-examine how we play guys, how many games, how many minutes that is, as long as they're healthy for the playoffs, we think, in looking at the landscape of the league and everything else that's happened, we think this core is good enough, especially what we saw from Chris in the playoffs and Dame, that we think that duo, Giannis and Brook Lopez, should be good enough. Maybe Brook doesn't close games for you, but I still don't. I think Giannis has to be your 5 to close games. I'm still very hesitant to say Giannis is your center going forward. You don't want that additional wear and tear on him. So
he doesn't. He don't want that either.
Yeah, but he doesn't
want it either. To be clear, right? I would.
Doesn't matter what we want. He doesn't want it. So yeah.
So it's not going to happen until he wants that.
I lean towards, I don't think they're going to trade Brook Lopez, even though I think he may have the most value of those 3 guys. We've talked about Bobby Portis, right? But I think it would be pretty easy to talk yourself into, well, we just need somebody that does what Brook Lopez does. And oh, by the way, it's a 1-year expiring contract at that point.
Yeah, I think and here's the thing too. If you're trading one or more of those guys in order to get under the second apron, then kind of like you've already made the moves that, okay, then what are the aggregating trades that you're now going to make because you're under the second apron? And it's like, well, you probably aren't going to make any more moves, right? Like those are probably the moves that you're going to make. So doing it just for the sake of getting in the second apron, I mean, probably the biggest incentive would be the fact that if you're, above the second apron going into next year, again, then you're looking at like your pick being frozen starting in 2032, and that's not ideal. But my guess is, what the sense that I get is that probably a lot of the teams that were second apron this year are probably going to be okay. Like they're just going to be resigned to being second apron next year. And then because we're going to see 10% cap increases every year from here on out, that's going to push that second apron number, also make that increase by, $20 million every year moving forward, given that the second apron next year is going to be probably a shade under 190. So again, like there's going to be more breathing room in subsequent years. And again, with these teams like the Bucks, even the Celtics, I mean, they're younger than the Bucks, but some of these second apron teams that we always talk about, the Suns, et cetera. I mean, the window is now for these teams, right? Like, again, we can talk about planning for the future and all that, but like, are you going to really like tangibly risk your window now because you want to have your 2032 first round pick available? Like, yeah, of course you could use that potentially to make deals and improve yourself. But I think in general, we saw last year when the penalties were very low for going over the second apron, teams just said, whatever, I'm not going to worry about it. This year they are more real. But again, like, a lot of these teams, I think, are kind of like have backed themselves into a corner that it may just make sense to kind of moving forward. I think a couple options. I don't think we need to like drain the moat on Brook Lopez trade options, because I would agree, like Justin, I think he's much harder to replace than, Bobby, who again, his bench scoring is unique, his durability. Both guys, you talked about the durability factor, is like sneaky important. But I think like if you were to make a move, like maybe there's a couple teams that you could maybe talk yourselves into having the combination of like bigs plus wings, where you could, with Brook, I think it would be about like disaggregating his salary. So taking the $23 million he's making next year and turning that into 2 smaller contracts. Like I kind of joked about the Pelicans, like, oh, well, Pelicans want a rim protector next to Zion. Like, all right, you're going to have to offer Larry Nance and how about Herb Jones for Brook Lopez? Okay, are they really going to do that? Probably not. They're trying to trade Brandon Ingram instead. But, if there was some scenario, right, Brook Lopez would be a fantastic complement to Zion Williamson. If there was some scenario, right, maybe the Bucks would throw in a pick, right, to get Herb Jones and Larry Nance, who obviously is not like a ideal starting center or something like that. He's a small ball 5, if that. But to get Herb Jones on a really nice contract, like, man, he would be a really nice 5th starter with this Bucks team, right? So again, Pelicans could be interesting. I think the Grizzlies could be an interesting option as well. Maybe don't have the obvious trade candidate because they dealt Steven Adams, but maybe the Houston Rockets. Right, they acquired Steven Adams, missed all of last year, the kind of remainder of the season. So I kind of forgotten he was even on the Rockets. Again, like, do the Rockets really need Brook Lopez with Alperen Şengün? I didn't think they needed him a year ago, but here we are, right? But maybe there is some scenario where they'd be interested in Brook still. Okay, Steven Adams would give you $12 million salary. He'd obviously could be the kind of Brook replacement if he could actually stay healthy, be that like kind of big physical guy next to Giannis. And then what else do the Rockets have? Well, they got a bunch of young, interesting guys. Could you pry Tari Eason from the Rockets? Like, that'd be really interesting. Okay. But again, like, are the Rockets interested in doing something like that? Like, I have no idea. So I think the Magic are maybe the other interesting team, certainly for Brook at least, right? Treat the guy well, send him to Orlando, right? If you're going to trade him, is there Wendell Carter plus some other guy on that roster that would be interesting? Maybe. So, but I think that's obviously kind of a pretty key decision point here. I think we'd probably all agree, like, most likely Brook's not going anywhere. And then I think the next question is like, Pat doesn't have much value. So are you trading him with the 1st round pick as just like salary filler, and you're getting like, an upside play on some guy? Maybe, and then with Bobby, kind of similarly, like, is there a team that would value him high enough? Again, you've got picks that you could attach to him. Does that swing it to something that could make sense? I don't know, right? We could, again, spend a whole week probably talking about potential trade scenarios. But I think that's probably when we think about the offseason, again, I think you started thinking, like, do you have a financial target you're trying to hit? I think we probably all agree, probably not, right? You're probably not going to get yourself under the second apron. So you just try to basically create the best roster, and wherever you end up salary wise, you end up there. But I do think it is interesting on draft night, and we've all talked about it. Okay, so maybe you're not going to pull off a big trade. Maybe you try to do something opportunistic with Connaughton or Portis. And again, I would say look at that number 23 overall pick for a couple of reasons. One, even if you're not trying to get on the second apron, the luxury tax still matters. You're still paying huge multipliers on the margins for every dollar you spend over, right? Probably $4 or $5 for every dollar of salary you're spending. So looking at the salaries of the number 23 pick versus what you could pay the number 33 pick, right? The minimum salary that you could pay a draft pick, about $1.2 million for the 33rd pick. You got to pay almost $3 million in year one for the number 23 overall pick. And let's be honest, who do we have on this roster right now among the young guys? AJ Green's probably going to be around. Andre Jackson Jr. is probably going to be around. We don't know about Marjon Beauchamp. I don't think we know about Justin, your guy Chris. But realistically, like, what do we think, guys? How many young guys are going to be on this roster next year? It's not going to be six first, second, third year guys, right? I would say between the 2 draft picks and those 4 guys I just mentioned, it feels like at most 4 of those guys might be on the
between that group, at least 2 are gone, you would assume.
Yeah.
So bring someone in.
Yeah. So my guess, and I'll put it to you guys, if I was going to speculate, I might speculate that the 23rd pick gets traded in some sort of deal. Could be for future picks, right? To punt kind of down the road, to have more assets to move, maybe, make a trade later. could be with a Connaughton or a Portis for, you know, another player, maybe other future picks. Could be, you know, straight up for another young play, you know, some kind of deal where you're trading Marjon Beauchamp with the 23rd pick for some, you know, young player on a rookie contract or something of that nature. But I would not be surprised at all if, given that 23rd overall pick is going to cost more than 2x the 33rd overall pick, and you don't have really 2 slots on this roster anyway for new young guys, I would say, again, my guess is maybe Marjon Beauchamp is gone some point this summer, and you replace him with, let's just say I'll pick the 33rd pick, and maybe that first round pick ends up getting moved for something else. But that just kind of feels like more likely to me, certainly, than the idea that you're going to keep both of those picks and put them on the roster next year. Again, maybe you do that. Maybe you do trade, you know, 1 or 2 of the guys currently on there. Certainly, I don't think any of us would be surprised if Marjon Beauchamp was shocked. But again, you know, he's only been here 2 years as well. So I mean, I also don't want to bury him quite yet. And you know, with Chris Livingston, like, I mean, obviously they have some reason that they felt compelled to pay him more money.
Clear all-star in the making. I don't know what you mean. Reason.
It remains hilarious to me that he got more guaranteed money than Andre Jackson, despite getting picked, whatever it was, 27 picks later, 25 picks later. So I'm guessing he's probably going to be around this year, but wouldn't be shocked if he was moved in some very ancillary deal. But that kind of feels right to me. Like, what do you guys think? I mean, do you guys feel like the first round pick, like, do you think they're going to find someone they like there, or potentially keep 2 of those early picks? Because the other flip side is, if you keep that first round pick, you've got 4 years of cost control, and if you really talk yourself into somebody, then that's better than, you know, having a couple years with the guys that you currently have on the roster still cost contained.
I think, to your point about the number of young guys we think that the Bucks will keep, like, let's say, for example, they did keep and they picked with that first round pick and they picked with that second round pick. Like, now you have 6 young guys on your roster. Like, that's almost half of your roster being taken up by young guys. And generally speaking, with championship teams, they tend to be more veteran led because you're trying to get to that championship. And when you have young guys out there on the court, they're going to have to learn through experience. And when you're trying to go for a championship, sometimes you don't have that much time to teach. You just have to be ready and get out there and go. And for that reason, the idea of trading the first round draft pick, I think, makes a lot of sense for the Milwaukee Bucks. Like, if that's the route that they go, I will not be surprised. And then maybe they just keep that second round pick, because, as you mentioned, it is nice having cost control over a player. So why not have one in your second rounder where it's going to be cheaper? And also, it's a good second round pick because it's coming from Portland. So it's going to be really early on in the second round. It's not like we're entering into an NBA draft here where it's like stacked throughout. So like, if you're going to try to take a shot at a role player, you might just look at a high upside guy there, keep him, trade that first round draft pick, maybe package up another young guy there, and see if you can upgrade your roster in some way to get a little bit more experience, in addition to the athleticism, in addition to defense, or whatever it is that they're going to be looking for in that skill player. And that's something that I definitely want to have a conversation about as well. Like, looking at the Bucks roster and thinking about free agency, Frank, in the sheet that you put together, I love the categories that you used for some of the possible targets for the Bucks, and just how you pretty much gave them an archetype, like a defensive combo guard, a wing athleticism, like mobile big, bench creator, a wing shooter. And when looking at the Bucks and thinking about their areas of need, like, what would you say is the biggest need for the team at this moment? Because, like, thinking about the past season, thinking about the roster, we've mentioned backup point guard, another ball handler, something that's going to be important for the Bucks. We've talked about how that defensive stopper is going to be important for the Bucks, especially where that 5th starter, we're assuming Malik Beasley will not be back. We mentioned Orlando as somewhere for Brook Lopez, but I think Malik Beasley in Orlando makes some sense as well as a free agent. They definitely need some more shooting, and he can bring that in droves. But when you're thinking about that 5th starter, like, that's where that defense part comes in. But then you're thinking about your bench, and you're like, okay, we need a point guard. Thinking about that big rotation. If you do get off of Bobby or you move Brook, you're going to need another one in there. And honestly, like the Bucks probably do need a more defensive, mobile big in that rotation as it is right now. Maybe that's who that draft pick goes to. Maybe if they keep that second rounder, they draft a young big who can kind of learn a little bit behind Brook Lopez for a year. But it's just really interesting to think about what is the biggest need for the Bucks this offseason, especially if somebody like a Patrick Beverley does not come back to the team next year.
Before we tackle that, let's squeeze in one break here. And then after that, too, I have one question about the draft for both of you guys. So we'll get to that coming up here after the break. Time to talk to you now about our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. And LinkedIn is the place to go when you're hiring for your small business. You want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you need to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all of that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire, so they're constantly finding ways to make the process easier, and even launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making that process even quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring, and you should do the same. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, Frank, the question that Camille had laid out there, one other thing I want to add to it is Camille, so you're of the mindset that first round pick is probably moved before the draft.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
With this draft being viewed as it is, historically not great, when you think about first round picks, you would think, well, it doesn't really carry a lot of value because this draft isn't good. But I think there's a school of thought that the later it is or in the middle of it, that's actually where you'd rather pick because you don't want to miss too high. And we say it every year, whenever or every time there's a bad draft, you always find guys that either surprise or at least become role players and rotational guys on the team. And that's right around the spot where you would find them. So maybe I'm not going to say it's, highly sought after, but that may add a little more value, if not to 23, at least to that area.
Yeah, I think I always hesitate, whenever people say it's a weak draft, whatever. I mean, first off, I always think back to 2013 and, the knock on that draft was a lot of times that is driven by perception of the top of the draft. And it's shorthand for there's not a super duper star at the top of the draft, or the top 10 isn't littered with guys that we think are going to be, surefire future all-stars. Right. But, it's like, then you look at the history of the draft, right? 2013, 2014, the two most consequential drafts of, the modern Bucks era. 2013, bad draft. Bucks famously go all in to be an 8 seed and get wiped out by the Heat. They pick 15th. Boy, what a crappy outcome for that year, right? Absolute dead in the middle, and you draft the greatest player in franchise history and one of the best players, in the history of the sport, and who wins you a championship. The next year, the draft was supposed to be littered with future all-stars. You tank, you do the quote-unquote right thing, and you end up with Jabari Parker, and 4 years later, he's walks for nothing. So, or not nothing. They were able to give Ersan Ilyasova a full mid-level contract offer at least, but so I always hesitate to, like you said, to be, and again, it comes somewhat from ignorance because I'm not obviously deep in the draft piece of this. I won't kind of like, again, try to prognosticate who the Bucks might take if they did stay where they are. I did want to at least acknowledge too, is some people may be thinking to themselves, well, if you don't want to take multiple young guys in this draft, why not try to package 23 and 33 together to try to move up and have a chance at a better player, right? If the whole point is you really need to hit on a young guy and whatever, then what if you could move to 15 by packaging those pieces together, right? I'm just making that up. I mean, I would certainly consider it. Certainly, the history of John Horst would say that I don't think we've seen. When was the last time the Bucks moved up in the first round of the draft? I honestly don't know. I mean, like there was the tractor trailer draft.
Tractor, yeah. Was that it?
I'm trying to think like if there's been a more recent example of them moving up in the first round. And I'll let you guys scratch your chin on that one while I blather on a little bit. But somebody's probably listening to this and be like, "Oh, you guys are idiots! You forgot about." But again, like I would say that's probably less likely. And again, part of this is just, again, not to get overly fixated on the kind of salary component of it, but when you have a salary sheet that is as expensive as the Bucks have, you have to look at almost every guy and just say like, well, all right, we're paying Marjan $3 million a year. Are you better off just, if someone gave you a second rounder for him and just, basically resetting with a guy that you can pay $1.2 million? And that's probably $7 to $8 million in total payroll with taxes and all that. So that's just the kind of calculus. So on the flip side is if you, again, trade up, package those 2 picks, now suddenly instead of getting a 33rd pick for 1.2 and a 23rd for $2.9 million, now you're getting one guy for, 4 million, 5 million, whatever it might be. Again, like these are all the things like the Bucks probably are going to weigh. I think in practice, I think they're probably going to be most concerned with just getting the best player they think is available. But again, are they going to have enough conviction to make a move like that? Again, we'll see, but we've got some time before the draft to figure that out. So, but I think the one thing, again, from what I've thought about the draft and looking at the free agents available and the discussions we've had about the big men, on the one hand, like it seems like you can generally find like a decent, like respectable backup big for a minimum deal every year. Andre Drummond is always out there, guys. You can always get Andre Drummond for a minimum contract. But if you're thinking about like in practice, the Milwaukee Bucks needing to think about like Brook Lopez and the ticking clock with him being on an expiring contract next year, and kind of what does the future of that position look like? I think it's natural to think about a center. Rolling the dice on a young center who wouldn't have to come in and be a starter or high minute guy. Doesn't have to be Derek Lively for the Mavericks, for instance, in his first year, right? But a guy that maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, ideally maybe that guy does hit, right? And there are a number of guys, in the first round who, I think are bigger guys, sort of in that range that the Bucks might at least have a shot at. Whether it's, I think Khalil Ware seems like he's probably going to go before the Bucks pick, but he's been a guy who seems like potentially in that mid first to later first round range. I think Deron Holmes is a guy that could be available later in the first rounds. Yves Missy, athletic big guy coming out of Baylor. Again, it sounds like you would potentially have an option to take a dice roll on a bigger guy at that point in the draft. And again, is it worth it, right? That's kind of what the Bucks have to figure out. And maybe there's a guy just as good that would still be available at 33, right? So that's kind of all that the Bucks have to figure out. But yeah, I don't know, Justin. I just kind of took Camille's question and just ran with it for a while. I mean, anybody that you're thinking of in the draft at this point, or anything, I guess, philosophically with the draft that you're thinking about beyond, kind of what we've already hit on?
No, I think that last part you basically nailed my thoughts. I would lean towards, I think they're going to trade that pick for all the reasons that we already laid out, certainly the financial ones, but also, the big one that we touched on in a previous show too with Ty, and we talked about earlier in this one. You're not going to have a 50-50 roster of vets, and then 50% of it is the young guys. So, that number that we said too, of I would assume at least 2 of those players or assets are not on the team next year for that reason. So I think that would lean towards trading the pick. If they did keep it, I'm not going to profess to have heavily followed any of these guys similar to you guys, but it would just be we got to find a big or start to think about who can we bring along. And as you pointed out, at least we assume with how the roster currently sits, at least it's not a, hey, you got to step in from day one and you've got to start and you've got to play heavy minutes. And this is how you got to play next to Giannis. And these are the things that we're looking for, that you can bring them along slowly. It doesn't even have to be a center, just a big that can play out there and ideally defend multiple positions. So to me, that's really the big approach, because we've said for years too, the Bucks have been incredibly thin in the front court, that you were fortunate enough that the three guys that you have had for the better part of 3 seasons now have been pretty durable for you. And you've been able to lean on them and mix and match different lineups because of that. But as we saw in the playoffs and through different portions too of the last couple of seasons, when you think about Brooke missing 2/3 of a season, when one of them is gone, you see just how thin you are. So to me, that's really the biggest piece that the Bucks have to start to address here. As we've mentioned, the most obvious ones of, hey, you got to get younger, you got to get more athletic, you have to have bigger wings and guys that can defend on the perimeter. I mean, that's something every team needs, but the Bucks also need to start thinking about, we need some depth, because I think the big piece of that is we've seen now the last couple of years, we went through this phase of the center position is dead and it's all positionless basketball, which it largely still is, that positionless portion of it. But we're seeing a lot more size being introduced. It's not back to the basket, but I think you still need size to win in this league. You see the success the Timberwolves had. If you get to the finals, you think about, well, maybe that's the T-Wolves. Maybe that's the Nuggets. Maybe it's this guy in San Antonio that is going to be pretty good for the next handful of years. And then, of course, Joel Embiid in the Eastern Conference. So you need size, and I think that's the big thing that we've learned through these 2 years, especially with injuries. This portion of it in terms of what the Bucks need to address, we'll wrap it there. We are going to do a part 2 where we will take a look at some individual players and that list that we mentioned that Frank put together, and Camille and I picked some names of ours as well. So we will start to get into that on part 2 of this episode. Camille and I will return to wrap things up after this. Passion, drive, and patience. That is the formula for winning championships, and it is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, we still have quite a bit of meat on the bone here, so we're going to stretch this into a part 2 coming up on tomorrow's show. We continue the conversation with Frank and Camille and start to single out some individual players. Frank put together his list of somewhat attainable to possibly very attainable players for the Bucks this offseason, so we share our thoughts on those players. Some of the internal candidates that the Bucks have as well, and more of a discussion on the young players. So we continue our look at the offseason and free agency for the Bucks coming up on tomorrow's Locked On Bucks. For Frank and Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.